Okay, so my apologies. I'm not going to be able to answer all of your questions about the tests like during the break or after class. If it's at all possible, could you come to my office hours or the logic lab where we can deal with most of these? Is that all right? There's just not enough time to talk to everybody. Okay. So, but do talk to us. So if there's for example, an addition error or something like that, which is possible, or if you think that something has been mismarked, then do let us know. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So we've got some symbolizations to do this week. So we're just going to continue on symbolization and predicate logic all this week. We're going to cover the skills for the first 5 today and the second 5 on Wednesday. Just a quick note about Logic 2010 going forward. So the unfortunate fact is that somebody had to type in the answers for Logic 2010. There's no algorithm, there's no positive and reliable technique that goes from a sentence to a symbolization, or further, the set of all possible symbolizations of a sentence, which means that they had to type in what they thought was the answer. And that means that not all of the things that are valid answers are necessarily recognized by Logic 2010 as a valid answer. So you may find yourself legitimately in the following situation. You've got what you think should be a good answer to that question, and Logic 2010 is not accepting it. This shouldn't happen all that often, but if you've got a kind of novel or unique way of symbolizing something that looks to you like it should be okay, but it's not being accepted, it's possible that Logic 2010 is wrong and you are right. Okay? So if you're in that situation, the thing to do is to get on Quarkus, get on the discussion board, and we'll try to, like, as humans, sensitive humans, try to figure out whether you're right or not, and then just tell you what the acceptable to Logic 2010 answer is. I'm sorry about that. It's just the limits of the software. If you know of a better logic program, please let me know. This is the best one I know of, and it's free. So here we are. OK. Any questions about that or about the test or anything like that? Course business questions? No? We all good? Undoubtedly, many of you have questions about how your specific test was marked. I don't doubt that. But we'll have to deal with those on an individual basis. OK. Oh, by the way, the average for the test was very high. The average was 81%. So well done, everyone. This is kind of typical for this course. The first test has a very high average. And then the averages go down, so not like precipitously down. We typically don't end up with like a 60% average or anything wild like that, but the averages do tend to go down. The material gets harder, and also there's typically a lot of people in this class who have taken like the first half of it and then dropped out, and this is their second run through it. So those people really crush the first test. Some of you will continue to crush these tests. We had a couple of I didn't count the actual number, but there's more than 100% on these tests. So a few people got perfect on this test, which I'm very pleased with. It means that we didn't write a fundamentally broken test when that happens. So, OK, one last chance. Any questions about this stuff? Broad questions about course structure or anything like that? Yeah? OK. So let's do some new stuff then. Let's talk about scope and binding. OK, so remember this. Recall that we've got these two quantifiers. This shouldn't, I know it's been, I hope your reading week went well. I hope you didn't forget absolutely everything about logic. And I hope that you didn't beat yourself up too much for not getting as much done as you'd hoped. I tried not to. Recall that we've got these two quantifiers, the existential and the universal quantifier. The existential says there exists at least one thing that has the property x, and the universal says for all things they have the property x. And recall this, so I'm trying to set you up for why you want to learn scope and binding. Recall that these are basically the meaning of these quantifiers. What these quantifiers are saying is something like, there's at least one name that we could plug in for x such that the sentence comes out true. There's at least one. So if you had names for everything in the universe, call this projector thing George, this podium Bill, the stage Fran, there's at least one name that would make the sentence true. And the universal says, for any name whatsoever, we have names for every object in the universe, every single name could be plugged into this sentence, and the sentence will come out as true, right? So these are the kind of procedures that the quantifiers represent. Now, that means that, for example, a universal quantifier, and we'll expand on this when we get to invalidities, you could replace the universal quantifier with the following really long sentence. We say, you could replace it with a sentence that doesn't have a quantifier in it. You say, if A has got the property F, then A has got the property G. And if B has got the property F, then B has the property G, and so on and so on and so on for all the names in the universe. Right? So we take this relatively compact sentence, we could expand it out into this presumably very, very long sentence. Right? So those two things are exactly equivalent in their meaning. Okay. And we translating that exact same thing in a natural language, we could say, if the property F is being fun and the property G is being gregarious, then we say if Aaron is fun, then Aaron is gregarious. If Bianca is fun, then Bianca is gregarious. On and on and on. Okay. But here's what this sentence definitely doesn't say. It does not say if Aaron is fun, then Cash is gregarious. Right? So it has to be, when we're applying this procedure, it has to be that you're substituting the same name for each instance of the variable. It's got to be the same name. Right? The sentence is not made true by Aaron being fun and Cash being gregarious. We're saying the same object, if it has this property, then it has that property. Right? So there's restrictions on what you're allowed to substitute in. That is, every instance of the variable has to be substituted for the same object. Okay, so we're good so far? This is just setting you up for the concept of scope and binding. Okay. So what about in this sentence? We got two quantifiers put together with a biconditional. There exists an x such that fx or gx, if and only if, for all x, if mx, if and only if gx. Do you need to substitute the same object in both, or can it be different objects? That's the question that we're going to address right now. Okay. So, a variable that is attached to a quantifier, we say it's bound to that quantifier. And the variables a quantifier is bound to are its scope. So the scope of a quantifier, its scope is all those things that are bound to it, all the variables that that are bound to it. And a variable is bound to one and only one quantifier. So scope and binding. These are the basic terms. And then the question is, what are the scope of these two things? What quantifiers are those variables bound to? It's not, there's about 3 rules that determine which variable, which quantifier a variable is bound to. It's not too tricky, but we do need to do it carefully so that we get it right. Okay. So here's some rules. A quantifier can only bind a variable if a variable is within the scope of the quantifier. What are within the scope of a quantifier? Atomics right after a quantifier are within its scope. So if you have for all x fx, that x is bound to the scope of that for all. And furthermore, things within the brackets right after a quantifier are potentially within its scope. Potentially. There's some complications here. So here's some examples. The bar, the black line underneath, indicates the scope of each quantifier. So the scope of the quantifier is indicated by the bar that's underneath it. So for all x fx, that x after f is within the scope of the quantifier. That should be straightforward, right? That for all x applies to the x that's immediately after it. Yeah? That's the easiest case. Now, with more complex sentences, with non-molecular sentences, you got a bracket, and then whatever's inside that bracket is potentially under the scope of that quantifier, with one exception that we'll talk about soon. But generally speaking, in the simpler cases, when things are going well, it's just whatever's in the brackets after the quantifier. Okay? Which means that that sentence that we started with, with the scope of those quantifiers end when their brackets end. So the scope of a quantifier can't extend beyond the brackets that happen after it. You don't get to bind a variable that's like outside of your brackets. So there exists a y such that fy or gy. The scope of that there exists a y ends when the brackets that start immediately after it end. And then for all x, mx, if and only if gx, again, it's just whatever's in the brackets. Okay? This should be, I feel like this should be just how you would have assumed it works, right? This is just how you would have assumed that the variables get attached to their quantifiers, more or less. I don't know why we would have intuitions about that, but whatever. Okay. Okay. Now, let's do some complications to this, because there are a couple of wrinkles that we need to sort of get clear on. So you can have one quantifier inside another quantifier, right? Now, the scope, for example, so here are some straightforward cases where the two quantifiers, the one embedded quantifier has got a different variable. It's pretty clear, right? So for all x, if hx, then lx, the scope of that is just the brackets that attach to that universal, and the scope of the existential, the big existential, is just whatever's inside the larger set of brackets. Yeah? So that should be reasonably clear. Yeah? Same thing with this one. So this is a like mildly more complicated example on the bottom row. It's not the case that having a quantifier just ends the scope. So having an embedded quantifier doesn't end the scope of the first quantifier. So that final or hx, that hx is still within the scope of the original quantifier. It's within the brackets. It's within the scope of that quantifier. Yeah? Okay. So this gets mildly trickier when you use the same variable with two different quantifiers in the same sentence. So this is where the potential to get tripped up starts to creep in. So it's not the case that y means the same thing in both of those sentences. So if we're substituting names into this, you don't have to substitute the same name into the existential on the left as you do to the universal on the right. It doesn't have to be the same object, despite the fact that you've used the same variable. So once the scope of a quantifier ends, it's kind of like you forget that you ever talked about that letter. It's a fresh variable once you start a new scope, a fresh variable. So if you've got some object that satisfies f and g, you make the antecedent true. Now, it doesn't have to be that same object being substituted into the universal. The universal applies to all objects, so it's like ranges over a whole new universe. Right? So once the scope of a quantifier ends, if you see the same variable under the scope of a different quantifier, it's not necessarily the same object. Could be, but it's not necessarily. Okay? So you don't get to assume that whatever you plugged in for y on the left is the same thing as you plug in for y on the right. Good? Okay. Right, so just to fill out this example, suppose f is fun, g is gregarious, l is likable. This sentence says, if something is both fun and gregarious, then something is both fun and likable. Yeah? So the first part says there exists some y such that y has f and y has g. So if that's true, then there exists some y such that y has f and y has L. That's true if there's one person who's fun and gregarious. Let's say Cash is both fun and gregarious, and some totally other person who is fun and likable. Suppose Cash is fun and gregarious, but he's a bit of a jerk, so he's not likable, right? So it's not the case that you could substitute Cash in for that consequent and have it come out as true. But Cash made the antecedent true, then the scope of that quantifier ends, and we've got a new quantifier with a new scope. We just need something, at least one thing to get plugged in there. Suppose Anne is fun and likable. She's not a jerk. So she makes the consequent true. So if Cash is fun and gregarious and Anne is fun and likable, that sentence comes out as true because there's at least one thing to satisfy the antecedent and one thing to satisfy the consequent. But it doesn't have to be the same person in both because the scope of the quantifier has ended. We start a new scope. Yeah? Okay. If you're writing symbolic sentences, if you're symbolizing something, the nice thing to do, the helpful thing to do is to use a new variable. You're not running out of variables. You're not going to burn through them all. You don't have to reuse them. But nonetheless, you need to be able to interpret sentences where they're not as nice and friendly, right? So for clarity's sake, there's absolutely no reason in the world why you couldn't use X for one and Y for the other. It helps you keep it clear, and when you're symbolizing, I strongly recommend that you do that to make it easier for yourself and whoever's marking your paper. Yeah? But that's not logically required. This is logically just fine. Yeah? Okay. So, another rule. And this one's, I mean, again, it should be fairly obvious, but we're going through this so that we get this exactly right. So a variable is only bound by a quantifier if it's the same letter as the quantifier. So x, for all x, does not bind that gy. It's a different variable. When you're substituting names in for those variables, you don't substitute something in for y. You only substitute it in for the x's. Yeah? So they only bind the same name, same letter. Yeah? Good? Okay. Now, here's a wrinkle. The innermost quantifier takes precedence in binding variables. So, this is an annoying, somebody's written this sentence, it was me, in an annoying way. They've been unhelpful in how they've represented this sentence because the variable x appears twice, doesn't it? That's a bad way of, it's an unhelpful way of having written this, but it's logically just fine, which tells you something about the nature of logic, I think. So we've got this big wide existential, the whole thing. So the scope of that existential, the first existential, ranges over the whole sentence. But then embedded within that sentence, there's another, there exists an x. Now, we might ask ourselves, and then another, there exists a z, but that's not the tricky bit here. The tricky bit is, what's up with this hx? What is that bound to? And your intuitions might fail you here. Your intuitions might tell you that that hx is bound to there exists an x, the whole big one, the one at the very beginning of the sentence. But that's not right, okay? Because the innermost quantifier takes precedence over the outermost one. So if I say there exists an x such that fx and there exists an x such that this thing, that hx, because it's bound under the scope of the smaller scope existential, is bound to the smaller scope one. It's bound to the innermost quantifier, not the big one that is the whole thing. Okay, so it's bound to the smallest scope under which it falls. Again, just a profoundly unhelpful way of having written that sentence, because there's nothing, logically speaking, nothing changes if you say there exists a y such that fy, and there exists an x such that this thing. Right? That would be logically equivalent to this sentence. It's just that they've used x twice. If I was inventing logic, I'd make them not be allowed to do this. But I didn't invent logic, which is probably on the whole a good thing, but we're stuck with this weirdness nonetheless. Okay? So it's tempting to think that that hx is under the scope of the largest existential, but it's not. It's under the scope of the smaller one. The innermost one takes precedence. Okay? Reasonably clear? Good. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about these very odd beings, free variables. A free variable is not bound by a quantifier. So you can have, in your derivations, you'll see some free variables. In your symbolizations, however, you should never end up with free variables, because they don't translate to any English sentence. You can't say what they mean in natural language. So here's an example. Suppose that first sentence there has nothing else that it's embedded in. That's the whole sentence. For all x, if fx, then gy. That y is not bound to any quantifier. It's a free variable. And I don't know how to say that sentence in English. And it's not just because I didn't bother to try to look it up. There's just no sensible way of saying it. So I can say, you know, this sentence says, for all x, if x has the property f, then gy is the closest I can come to saying that out loud. Because it's a variable, but it's not bound to anything. If only it was a name, if only it was from letter A to I, then I'd be able to say something sensible. If it was a name, then I'd be able to say, for all x, if x has the property f, then this thing I has the property g. That's a sentence that you can kind of make sense of. This doesn't make sense as an English language sentence. Nonetheless, they might show up in your derivations, so you need to be able to see and understand a free variable. Let's see, we got a free variable in here as well. And iy, by, jx. No, there's no free variable in there. That's weird. I can't remember why I put that on the slide. maybe to emphasize, for example, that not jx is not a free variable. It is not a free variable because it falls under the scope of the ex. Yeah?
So for the first one,
yeah.
what's preventing you from just saying G as a name? Like, why can't you just translate it as if X is fun, then some other Y is gregarious?
Right. So we'll kind of use them in that way, actually. When we're doing derivations, we will, in some sense, use free variables as though they were names. In derivations, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to say, if you have a free variable, it's as though you're saying, you know, suppose there's some object. Let's call it Henry. Henry must have this and that property. But imagine that you don't know any Henrys. You're just sort of throwing out a random arbitrary name and then using it as a placeholder for some specific object. But it's still not like a name in the sense that you're saying this object. So that's kind of how we're going to treat free variables in our derivations. But it's not really what it says just as such. So, yeah. OK. All right, so I think the point of the second sentence is just to point out that x, not jx, is not a free variable. Just because it is under the scope of another quantifier, it doesn't become free just because it's under the scope of the for all y, because it's also under the scope of the original there exists in x. So all of those variables are bound to a quantifier or other. There are no free variables in the second sentence. OK. And just to say this again, if you see a free variable in a derivation, that's fine. And how to deal with them in derivations will become clear as we do derivations. If one shows up in your symbolizations, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Something has gone really badly wrong. Because your symbolizations are trying to symbolize English sentences. So they should be interpretable as English sentences, whereas a free variable is not interpretable in English or any other natural language. It's not just that English sucks. Okay. Okay, so to review, let's review this stuff. So a variable is bound to a quantifier if and only if the following three things obtain. The variable is within the scope of the quantifier. Usually it's inside its brackets, other than the very simple case where it's just immediately after the for all x fx. Typically it's just within the brackets. So 1, it's within the brackets. 2, it's the same letter. And 3, it's not already bound to another quantifier. So that's the exception. Most of the time you can just say, well, whatever's in the brackets is under the scope. The only exception is when there's a quantifier inside the scope of the quantifier that takes precedence for that variable. Okay? Okay, so that's scope and binding. Any questions about scope and binding before we move on? Hopefully this is not too, other than the third clause there, I think it's reasonably intuitive. It's just how you thought it would be in terms of what gets associated with what. All right, good. One more wrinkle, names. A name is not bound to anything. Why is it not bound to a quantifier? Because it's a name. It just refers to the thing it refers to. So these quantifiers, you recall, are kind of procedures. Each quantifier embodies a procedure where we say, okay, here's what the quantifier says. It means we can either go through all the names in the universe and find one that fits it, or go through all the names in the universe and everything will fit it. But a name is just a name. It's just a thing. It's a specific thing. So this says, for all x, if this specific thing A has the property F, then everything has the property G. I don't know. Maybe F is the property of being God or something. So A is the name of God and F is the property of being God. So if there's a God, then everything is good. I don't know. I don't know how to make that sentence true, but that's one possible way. It's a weird sentence because it says if this specific object has a property, then everything else in the universe has that property. Oh, I thought of a way of making this true. The philosopher Jerry Fodor has a wonderful example of a particle called a phrygion. A phrygion is a particle that is a particle when Jerry Fodor's fridge is on. So it's a property that everything in the universe has. When his fridge is on, everything in the universe has that property. And when it's off, it doesn't. So A is Jerry Fodor's fridge, and F is the property of being on. So if A has the property F, then everything in the universe has the property of being G, G being a phrygion. There you go. That's what that sentence says. Okay. An unnecessarily complicated example for a fairly straightforward concept. All right. Okay, so that was scope and binding. That was scope and binding. So that was basically by way of making sure that we get the grammar of these quantifiers correct, that we know what a quantified sentence is saying. So now for the rest of the class, I propose to go through some more symbolization stuff. Basically, we're just going to do symbolization stuff for the rest of the class. Okay. Right. Okay, so here's some good old-fashioned Aristotelian logic. Wow, this is old stuff. This is really old stuff. If I'd showed you, this is a way of parsing out the different kinds of generalizations that exist that Aristotle would have liked. The universal affirmative, every A is B. The particular affirmative, some A is B. Universal negative, no A is B, and particular negative, some A is not B. Okay, so I'll go through a couple of these just to kind of point out some interesting features and add some wrinkles, add some skills to our symbolization stuff. So recall, just to bring this back to your memory, recall last time we talked about specifying the topic of a generalization and then the thing being said about that topic. We can narrow and broaden our generalizations. I think we're in the universal affirmative right now, and we're saying all things such that that are in this category have this property, all A's are B's. So I want to just point out this interesting thing that we can do where we are narrowing or broadening the scope of our generalizations. Oh, I should have added examples here. Sorry. So adding and statements to the antecedent narrows the topic, and adding or statements to the antecedent expands the topic. Oh boy, that's terrible. So there was an example like this in the symbolizations from last week, which is why I want to kind of get this very explicit and be very careful about this. So if we're going to say, actually I'll do this in open board. Right. So if we're going to say, for all x, if fx and gx, then hx. So that was equivalent. Recall this stuff where we said this is the same as saying then gx, then hx. Okay. You recall we said those are two equivalent ways of narrowing down the topic. So we're saying, let's say f is fun, g is good, and h is happy. Okay, so these sentences are saying if something is both fun and good, then it's happy. So that narrows the scope of the generalization to only the things that are both fun and good. What if we wanted to expand the scope of the generalization? We would do that with an or statement. We would say the following. We could say, for all x, if fx or gx, then hx. Yeah? So this narrows it. This expands it. So now this sentence is about anything that is fun or good. And this one is about things that are both fun and good. Right? So the or expands the scope. Now, here's the trick. Sometimes you'll see sentences with and in them, and the and is meant to broaden the scope. You say, fun and good things, things that are fun and things that are good are happy. So the way I constructed that sentence, things that are fun and things that are good are happy. That's meant to include both the fun things and the good things, right? So I'm expanding the scope of the generalization. That means despite the fact that I said the word and, you symbolize it with or. Now if I said things that are both fun and good, that's narrowing the scope. Right? So here's the trick. Here's what you want to remember. Sometimes a sentence that has an and in it requires that you use an or, because the and is functioning to expand the scope of the generalization, expand the topic of the generalization, rather than narrowing it down. So we'll see an example of this later, but roughly. So if you want to say Republicans and Democrats should follow the law, you're not talking about people who are both Republicans and Democrats, right? So that and functions to expand the scope to things that are Democrats as well as things that are Republicans. It is expanding the scope of the generalization, which means you need to use the or rather than and in the antecedent. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
So, can I have an example like this? If for all men and women, you're happy, and
Good.
while I use and, it's symbolized as or.
Right, right, good. So the example was all men and women are happy. Yeah. So you don't want it to be the case that that sentence says if something is both a man and a woman, then they're happy. You want to say if something is a man or a woman, then they're happy. Yeah? Unfortunately, logic has a lot of trouble dealing with non-binary people. I suppose that's counted under, if you use the or, that includes people who are both men and women. That works. Okay, that works. Good. Okay. So, expanding and narrowing the scope of your generalization. So whatever goes in the antecedent is the topic, and you can narrow the topic by using conjunction. You can expand the topic by using disjunction, such that anything that satisfies either this or that is in the topic of the generalization. How's that? Okay. If there's no further questions, I'll move on to the next thing. My apologies for having written add examples on this. Clearly. I'm going to confess, I didn't get everything done on reading week that I hoped to get done. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and just one more thing, and then we'll take a break and come back and do some more. But here's really just remember, this is not how you want to symbolize a universal affirmative. I think I mentioned this last time, but it bears repeating. Don't symbolize if I want to say everything is both an elephant and friendly, then this is fine. If your claim is everything in the universe is an elephant and everything in the universe is friendly, then that's how you would symbolize it. If what you mean to say is all elephants are friendly, then you need the conditional, right? So this is your standard way of symbolizing universal affirmatives should be conditionals. Your standard way of symbolizing particular affirmatives, there exists at least one friendly elephant, then you could use the existential. You say EX and FX. That would be fine. So universal particular, you use conjunctions or disjunctions. Universal affirmative, no, sorry, not universal particular, sorry. Particular affirmative, you use conjunctions, disjunctions, and the existential. Universal affirmative, you're going to use the conditional. Otherwise, you're making weird claims about everything in the universe being a friendly elephant, and that's, generally speaking, not what you want to say. Or maybe I'll put one on the test that's like this. Maybe I'll put a really absurd sentence on the test that just doesn't make any sense semantically, but you can see everything in the universe is an elephant and is friendly. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's take 10 minutes, and we'll come back and do some more. So just really quickly, I want to show you a thing on Logic 2010 that's neat and useful and potentially helpful for you to think about stuff on your tests. So here's a thing that you can do. You can click on User and input your own derivation. So if you're wondering whether the way you did your derivation on the test works or not, you can input it into Logic 2010 and test it out. So you'd say something like, so R, if R, then not Q, period, not W. So you have to learn the keyboard shortcuts, but it's worth doing anyway. And T, therefore, W and P. so you can type in your own derivation and attempt to solve it. And if your way of solving it works, that's going to be a very strong argument for me to remark your solution. It'll be a very strong argument. The one exception is the repeat rule, which I said we're diverging from Logic 2010 on. That is, I required it in places that Logic 2010 didn't, if you recall. But other than that, practically everything you're allowed to do on Logic 2010, assuming you're using the rules on the list of acceptable rules and only those rules, then practically anything that's okay for Logic 2010 is okay in this class. So if you're like, why doesn't that work? Like, shouldn't that work? You can try typing it into Logic 2010 and see if your solution is acceptable. That's going to be a very strong, it'll either tell you that no, it's not, and hopefully a little bit about why, or yes, it is, and then you can show me that, and I will be, I'll consider that maybe not completely decisive, but at least a strong argument that your solution worked. Okay? So it's also a fun way. Now you can explore the wonderful world of derivations. You can try out all of your own favorite derivations. It'll be so fun. You guys, it's so fun. Okay. There are limits to, people tend to believe what professors say, but there are limits. Okay. Okay, so let's do some more things. We got some more sort of like bits and pieces to add into our symbolization skills here. Let's talk about the particular affirmative. There exists something X which has both the properties J and K. We're saying there's at least one thing that has these properties. The wrinkle that I'd like to point out here is the pluralization, or lack thereof. So here are two reasonable ways of saying that sentence out loud. Some J's are K's, or some J is K. Now, the plural might make you think that this is a universal, right? Because we're talking about the class of J's. But don't get tripped up by that. That's not quite right, because we're saying some J's are K's. Right? And recall that our existential says there is at least one thing, and that's perfectly compatible with there being a bunch of things. So here's an existential generalization. There's at least one thing that's a human in this room. And that's true despite the fact that there's way more than one. Right? You wouldn't just say that. You wouldn't say it that way because people are not that weird, but the plural is perfectly compatible with it being an existential rather than a universal. So just because it says some J's are K's doesn't mean it's a universal. Okay? That's pretty straightforward, yeah? Okay. And once again, here is how not to symbolize the universal affirmative. Don't use the conditional. This is a very weird sentence. There exists an X such that if CX, then BX. It's a very weird sentence. Because the conditional is true anytime the antecedent is false. So there exists a cat that can bake cookies. Suppose that's the sentence we're trying to symbolize. I'm telling you, there's at least one cat that knows how to bake chocolate chip cookies. If I symbolize that as if C, then B, that sentence becomes true if anything exists that's not a cat. Right? There exists an X such that CX, if CX, then BX is true anytime something fails to satisfy the antecedent, making the conditional true. So the very existence of non-cat objects makes that sentence true. And that's not what you mean. So if I tell you there's a cat that bakes cookies, I shouldn't be able to point to a non-cat object and go, here it is. I made it true. I made that sentence true. Here's the cat that bakes cookies. That's not what that sentence means, right? This is why we want to use the conditionals for the universal affirmative, not the particular affirmative. Yeah? Again, there probably is some sentence that that's a valid symbolization of. I just don't know what it is. It's just a very, very odd sentence. Okay. So don't do that. All right. Universal negative. Here's two ways of expressing the universal negative. So if anything is an A, then it's not a B. You could say for all x, if AX, then not BX. So the topic is all of the things that are A's. We're saying about all of those things that they are not B's. And here's an exactly equivalent way of saying that. There does not exist anything that is both an A and a B. Yeah? Two perfectly good ways of saying the same thing. We'll introduce some rules by which you could derive one from the other, but for now, I hope that it's just fairly intuitively clear that both of those sentences just rule out the existence of anything that is both A and B. Yeah? Good? Okay. And the particular negative, same basic thing. There exists something that does not have the property B. There exists an x such that not bx. And it's not the case that for all x, bx. We'll introduce a rule called quantifier negation, which makes this just one step to flip between those two sentences. Quantifier negation lets us derive one from the other. But again, we'll do that when we do derivations. Okay, just to foreshadow that a little bit, quantifier negation. So it's not the case that for all x, gx is equivalent to there exists something that is not gx. So it's false that you can do this procedure of going through the whole universe and finding, for everything, finding that it has the property g is just the same as saying that there's at least one thing that doesn't have the property g. Yeah? And of course, you can go the other way. There doesn't exist something that has the property g. That's exactly the same as saying everything fails to have the property g. These last two lines are slightly more complicated. So it's not the case that for all x, if fx then gx is the same as saying there exists something where it's not true that this thing, which by quantifier negation is the same as saying there exists something that has f and doesn't have g. You know what? This is probably better left for when we can manipulate these things in derivations. So don't worry too much about this, but just by way of foreshadowing, that there's a bunch of equivalences here. And this is going to be relevant to your symbolization work as well, because it's always going to be the case. So the point of showing you this is basically just to reiterate or just to emphasize the fact that for any of these general statements, it's always going to be the case that there's at least two ways of representing it, either as a universal or as an existential. So any quantifier negation tells us any universal can be turned into an existential, and any existential can be turned into a universal, which means that there's at least two ways of symbolizing everything that we're going to do for the next little while, any of the quantified sentences that we're going to do. One or the other of them is probably going to seem more intuitive to you, so just go with whichever one makes the most sense to you. But just to show you that there's always, as a matter of logic, there's always going to be more than one way of symbolizing these sentences. Okay. Let's do some examples. Oh, sorry, no. We're not even at examples yet. So more wrinkles. More wrinkles. Let's do only in the context of quantifiers. Only works almost exactly the same as it does in predicate logic as it did in sentential logic. So I want to symbolize a sentence, only small dogs are yappy. Only small dogs are yappy. So whatever comes after only is the consequent, which means whatever comes after only is the thing being said about a topic. So I want to say if something is both a dog and is small, I don't want to say that if it's a small dog, then it's yappy. That's the second sentence. So all small dogs are yappy. The topic of that sentence is small dogs. We're going to say about that topic that they have the property of being yappy. But if I say only small dogs are yappy, the real topic of that sentence is yappiness. It's the property of being yappy that's the topic of that sentence. We're saying everything that has this property, all yappy things, have the property of being small dogs. What would make the first sentence true is literally anything that's yappy that's not a small dog. So if you have a big dog that's yappy, then that first sentence is false, right? Yeah. Whereas the second one, it's compatible with there being a big yappy dog. It's just that any small dog that's not yappy would make that one false. So the point being, only does the same, an analogous thing in predicate logic as it did in sentential logic, which is just to, in some sense, flip the order of things. If I say all small dogs are yappy, small dogs go in the antecedent, just like if something is a small dog, then it's yappy. If, whatever comes right after if is the antecedent. Here, whatever comes after all is the antecedent. But if we say only, then that goes in the consequent. Whatever comes after only is still in the consequent, just like only if. How's that? Okay. Okay. Here's another thing we should clear up. Relative clauses. So this has been in a couple of the exercises already. Gotten some questions about this, so let's clear this up. Compare these two sentences. Dogs, which it's very dog-heavy examples this class. Okay. Dogs which are frisky are cute. Now compare that to dogs which are frisky are cute. So I'm going to say that those two sentences have quite different meanings. The first one, in some sense, is ambiguous between two different meanings, and the second one has a clear meaning, which is different. So we got two different types of relative clauses, restrictive and non-restrictive. So here's the non-restrictive relative clauses. This says two things. Basically, those two commas carve out a separate claim that's being made. It says two things. First, dogs are frisky, and then dogs are cute. It's like you got a little aside in the middle of a sentence. Say, dogs, which by the way are frisky, are cute. Right? You're sort of like stepping out of the flow of your sentence to make a separate independent claim, and then stepping back in to make the original claim that you started with. So that's a non-restrictive relative clause, and that's going to be marked by those two commas which carve out that clause from the rest of the sentence. Okay? When you see that, what you're going to do is symbolize that as a conjunction of two claims. It's a conjunction, not a narrowing of the topic. So that contrasts with a restrictive relative clause. Now, we're saying something about a specific type of things. We're saying those dogs which are frisky. So of the set of all dogs, let's talk about just the subset of those that are frisky. And now we're going to make a claim about those. So this is just those double narrowing. This is just narrowing the topic a little bit further and then making a simple one single claim about that narrower topic. So that's a restrictive. You're restricting the topic of conversation twice, to dogs and to frisky things, the things that are both dogs and frisky. And just saying one thing about them, that they're cute, rather than the non-restrictive relative clause, which makes two separate claims. Okay? So, as a matter of convention, so this sentence, written just the way it is ambiguous. Okay? You could say it could be restrictive, it could be non-restrictive. It's only when the commas are there that it's really clear what the meaning is. But so that we don't get confused, we're going to assume, for the purposes of this class, that if you see the commas, it's non-restrictive, and if you don't see the commas, then it's restrictive. Okay, that's not true in general. That's not like a rule of language, because this is a perfectly fine sentence. It's a perfectly fine way of saying the non-restrictive relative clause. I would recommend when you're writing, it helps to put the commas in to make it clear what you mean, because that's not an ambiguous sentence. With the commas, it's non-ambiguous. This is clear that it's a non-restrictive relative clause. This could be one or the other, but for this class, let's assume that without the commas, it's a non-restrictive relative clause. Without the commas, it's restrictive. With the commas, it's non-restrictive. Okay? So we're just going to stipulate that for this class, just so that there's one clear answer rather than weird ambiguities. Yeah? We good with that? So it's just a matter of remembering the commas that carve out this subclause are making an aside. They're making a separate claim. When you got two separate claims, you symbolize that with a conjunction. Okay. Yeah, so this is what it would look like symbolized. Dogs which are frisky are cute. It's just the two things in the antecedent. And then the non-restrictive relative clause is a conjunction of two universals. We're saying that the set of all dogs are frisky and the set of all dogs are cute. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Doesn't one with commas be symbolized with for all x, d of x implies f of x and c of x?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, it can. I would recommend you do it as two separate ones just to make it super clear. But that is logically equivalent. So, yeah. That's a good question. Okay. Okay. So, another wrinkle. Implicit universals. So, I don't want you to get too comfortable with the idea that any universal statement will have the word all in it, because they don't in general. You can make a universal statement without saying anything, without saying all or only. So for example, a good man is hard to find. It starts with a, which makes it sound like it's saying there's at least one man who is good and hard to find. But that is an implicit universal. Well, okay, so here's the, Once again, we're trying to cram the complexities of human language into a logical system that is less complex than human language. People do the following. So, all right. People will say sentences like this and kind of expect you to understand from context what they mean. And sometimes it might, as a matter of fact, work out that what they mean is that there exists at least one thing that's a man and is hard to find and is good. But I think it's more naturally read as a universal claim. And we came across this in the, again, this is something from the exercises last time. A chocolate should be enjoyed, I believe was the example. A chocolate should be enjoyed. And you have to, in some sense, you have to imagine the conversational context in order to get that. So it's just a really, I think they expected you to read that as universal because it's a weird sentence to just say, there exists at least one chocolate that should be enjoyed. The more sort of intuitive way I think of reading that is chocolates, the set of all chocolates should be enjoyed. But I can understand why you might find it to be ambiguous. Okay, here's another sentence, an implicit universal. If dogs are well fed, then they are happy. There's no all there. There's nothing that explicitly marks this out as a universal, except the plural on dogs. So if dogs are well fed, then they're happy. That's a universal claim about the set of all dogs. So you're simply not going to always have it explicitly marked that the sentence is a universal. And so it's going to be up to you to like work it out. This is just by so I'm going to add a little bit into this. Let's talk about generics. A generic is a sentence like birds fly or dogs bark. And they're actually ambiguous. There's nothing in English that distinguishes between, so if you say birds fly, are you saying all birds fly? Or are you saying there exists at least some flying birds? I don't think that there's a definitive answer to that based just on the sentence. You need to know the context in which people are talking about this. What about men are pigs? Is that a universal claim? Well, it's hard to tell. And the sentence itself does not tell you whether you're saying all, hashtag not all men, or are you just saying there exists men who are pigs? Are you saying generally speaking? That's, I mean, in English we have, or in natural language we have the universal, which says all things in this category have the property. We have the existential that says at least some of the things in this sentence have this property. And then we have generalities, like typically birds fly. So consider the sentence birds fly. Did anybody look at that and go, no they don't? I doubt it, but what about penguins and ostriches? Those are birds. Do they fly? I'll catch you up if you're behind on your ornithology homework. No, they don't fly, right? Does that make the sentence birds fly true or false? It's not clear, right? Depends what you meant by that. Okay, so we've got this built-in ambiguity in our language, and it matters a lot when you're making generalizations about topics, which version of it you mean. And the sentence itself just does not tell you which it is. So I'm going to say, just once again, for the sake of this class, because I don't want to throw you curveballs, I would like to give you questions with clear answers that you can answer. We're going to assume that the generic defaults to a universal. We have no logical way to represent the general, generally speaking birds fly. We've got no machinery for that. So what we're going to do is default. If you see a generic, assume that what they mean is all birds. If you see birds fly, assume they mean all birds fly. If you see dogs bark, assume they mean all dogs bark. If you see men are scum, I'm not going to put that on a test, so don't, yeah. Okay, yeah? So generics. I see people argue about this stuff on the internet all the time. Twitter is the worst for this. Somebody will throw out a generic and not clarify what they mean, and somebody will come at them and be like, not all of them. Be like, I didn't say all of them, and they just fight forever. And so if you want to be clear, disambiguate. Tell people how wide a scope your generalization is supposed to have, because the sentence itself is not explicitly one or the other. Okay, but for this class, birds fly means all birds fly. Not in language, not in natural language, just in this class. Because once again, we're jamming the complexities of human language into a fairly simple logical system. You can tell I've got residual anger about this. All right. Okay. I think that's all of the wrinkles that we're going to do on this stuff. So let's do some examples. Let's just do some practice for the rest. I'm just going to do practice until we run out of time. Okay. Unless there's questions about any of this stuff. Why are you so angry? I don't know. Okay. Okay. Let's do some practice. One thing I want to point out before we start, so when you get to the test, this is what the symbolization scheme is going to look like. I say the property D, and then I'm going to have a colon, and it's going to say italicized A. A is a dog. Why am I doing that? it's going to become clearer when we do multi-place predicate. So if I want to symbolize is taller than, I'm going to have two places. A is taller than B. That's why I need a place marker in there. So people did this last semester. I gave them this on the test, and everybody wrote A in as all their variables. Don't do that. We're going to use X, but just A is just a place marker for whatever the variable is. So we'll see that in a sec. Okay, so no dog is happy unless every dog is fed. Okay. Adorable, right? Very dog heavy today. Very dog heavy. Okay. Let's think back to our good old symbolization skills. What we're going to do is break the sentence up into its parts. I would say that the main connective of this is going to be the unless. Unless. So we know that this is going to be something unless something. So that's an or. We got a thing or another thing. Okay. No dog is happy. Oh. Oh, so sad. Okay. No dog is happy. So again, there's going to be at least two ways of symbolizing this, The one that comes to me is, it's not the case that there doesn't exist an X such that X is a dog and X is happy. Does that make sense to you? There's nothing such that it's both a dog and they're happy. A terrible, terrible sentence. But there's another way of symbolizing this, right? You could do, anytime you can symbolize something as an existential, you could also symbolize it as a universal. So let's just do that. So for all X, if something is a dog, because the topic is dogs, then they're not happy. Yeah? Just as good. Just as good. One or the other will probably jump out at you as like the intuitive way of dealing with this. Whichever one works for you, just go with it. I would encourage you to only write one answer on the test. So I marked a few of your tests. A bunch of people were putting more than one answer. And fortunately, every one that I looked at, both answers were right. But if you give us one right answer and one wrong answer, I don't know what to do with that. Probably going to mark it wrong. And it's just a decision. It's a decision you're giving your TA that they didn't have to make. So I will strongly encourage you to only write one answer on the test, even if there's more than one logically equivalent answer. It's good that you know. It speaks well to your logical ability, but only write one. Okay. So that's the first half. No dog is happy, or every dog is fed. I very naturally read that as, for all X, if X is a dog, then they're fed. Yeah? Notice that I'm using the same, I went ahead and used the same variable in both of these things. Again, that's not a problem exactly. I certainly could have said for all y, dy, then fy. That would have been just fine. Maybe a little nicer, a little clearer. But what I've got there is perfectly okay as well. Okay? Okay. Let's do another. It's too similar. Let's do another. Okay, here we go. Let's do a big, ugly one. Okay. If every dog is well fed, and every dog is an animal, and every animal is happy, then every dog is both well fed and happy. Aha. All right. So we're definitely in the realm where you don't want to try to parse this all at once. You want to take it piece by piece. What's the main connective here? What's the major connective of this sentence? It's the if-then. It's the if-then. Yeah. So something, then something. So we got this thing, then this thing. Okay. So let's try to parse the antecedent first. if this thing and this thing and this thing. So we'll have a three-part conjunction, right? Every dog is well fed. Every dog is an animal. Every animal is happy. So we've got a three-part conjunction, and now we're just going to drill down and deal with each chunk of this. So every dog is well fed. That seems to me, oh. So for all x, if it's a dog, then it's fed. I'll assume well fed is the same as fed. And, so that's this thing. Every dog is an animal. For all y, if something is a dog, then it's an animal. And every animal is happy. For all z, if it's an animal, then it is happy. Okay. All right. That whole thing was our antecedent. Let's put the whole antecedent in brackets. Say, then every dog is both well-fed and happy. For all w, let's say. If it's a dog, then both well-fed and happy, FW and HW. Bam. Yeah? Questions? This was at least partly, so I don't think any element of that was particularly challenging. The challenge was just not panicking and taking it one step at a time. Yeah? Absolutely. Yeah, so the question is, for the antecedent, could you have used x for each portion? Yes, you could have used it even for the consequent as well, because the scope of this keeps closing. So here's the scope of this one. 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 Because the scope is just those parts, you could have used the same variable for each and every one of those quantifiers, and it would have been no problem. I use different ones, at least partly to exemplify that you can use different ones, and at least partly because I find it easier to read and nicer, and I do at least attempt to be easy and nice some of the time. No. Okay. Any other questions? All right, let's do another. None but the brave deserves the fair. Apologize for the slightly preachy tone of these, but I got sick of dog examples, so. Oh, I never get sick of dog examples. Okay, but this one's a little harder, right? None but the brave deserve the fair. So, often it's going to be the case that you can make these things easier for yourself by rewriting them in a way that's more familiar. I would say this is equivalent to only the brave deserve the fair. Does that help? Does that look equivalent to you? And does that help? Because we've seen this not half an hour ago, what to do with only. And just like with sentential logic, whatever comes after only is the consequent. So, the brave is the consequent, and deserve the fair is the antecedent. Is this an existential or a universal? Universal. Saying none but the brave deserve the fair. We're saying this about everybody who deserves the fair, that they must be brave. So, say for all x, if somebody deserves the fair, gx, then it must be the case that they were brave. It's a horrible sentence. What about children? Don't they deserve the fair? That's horrible. Anyway. Questions about this? About how we got here? So, none but the brave. We're saying if anybody is brave, sorry, none but the brave, right? The brave should be the consequent. So if somebody's deserves the fair, then it must be the case that they were brave. This would be false if there's somebody who's not brave but deserves the fair. Yeah? So the only way to make a conditional false is for the antecedent to be true, the consequent to be false. The antecedent is deserving the fair. So if somebody deserves the fair, but it's false that they were brave, then this whole thing is false. So again, one way of testing your symbolizations is by asking yourself, what would make this sentence untrue, and does my symbolization rule it out? And of course, what would make it true, does my symbolization rule it in? Okay? Okay. Just going to keep doing a bunch of these things. Okay. Kettles boil quickly only if not watched. Kettles boil quickly only if not watched. Okay. So, this thing only if this thing. All right. It's pretty clearly a universal, right? For all x. Whatever comes after only if is the consequent, which means this must be the antecedent. So, the antecedent is kettles that boil quickly. Right? We got kettles boil quickly, so we need something to be both a kettle and boiling quickly. So, fx and gx. Then it must have been the case that it was not hx. It was not watched. So if your kettle's boiling quickly, then it was not watched. All right. Good? Okay, I only got one more, so we're almost done. Here's one that, you know, these questions sometimes age in funny ways. When this was written, this was a totally uncontroversial sentence. Democrats and Republicans who put loyalty above legality are detrimental to democracy. Okay. A completely uncontroversial sentence that nobody would disagree with and couldn't possibly take up parts of the news cycle. Okay. So, it's a universal, right? Once again, we're dealing with a universal. We're saying something about whole categories of things. We're not just saying that there is somebody who's got this property, right? Okay. So, a universal. We've got a universal affirmative here, right? We deal with the universal affirmative by figuring out what the topic is and what the thing being said about that topic is. So, who's the topic of this sentence? Who's the subject of the sentence? Democrats and Republicans. And here's what you're tempted to do. Here's what you're tempted to do. You're tempted to say fx and gx. Then. Why is that wrong? It's wrong because you're saying if somebody is both a Democrat and a Republican, then something, something. You've narrowed, by using the conjunction, you've narrowed the topic too far to the point where you're talking about somebody who doesn't exist. So that's not right. We need to be talking about Democrats and Republicans by using or. We expand the scope of our topic by using or rather than and. If somebody's a Democrat or they're a Republican, then this thing is true about them. Right? Okay. So, if somebody falls under either of these two categories, then who they put loyalty are and we have to narrow it down even further. We have to narrow it down even further. If they've got this, and they've got this. It's a lot of brackets. Okay. So, if somebody's a Democrat or the Republican, and they do the following, loyalty over legality, then they are detrimental to democracy. So this time we put 3 things in the antecedent, but 2 of them had to have a conjunction between it, or a disjunction between it, in order to make sure we capture both of them. But we're saying if somebody falls under either of these categories, and they have this property, then this is true about them. Yeah? Okay. That's enough for today. Thanks, everyone. We'll keep going on this on Wednesday.